Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to the 5th Annual Future of Speech Online. My name is Emma Lonzo, and I'm the Director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'll be your MC for today. First up today, we are honored to have a keynote address from a member of the European Parliament, Patrick Breyer, who's a member of the European Pirate Party, and which is also a member of the Greens and European Free Alliance group. MEP Breyer is also the lead rapporteur for the Civil Liberties Committee on the Digital Services Act, the European legislation that is revising the EU's approach to intermediary liability and online content governance. MEP Breyer was unfortunately not able to join us live, but we'll go now to a set of recorded comments that he was kind enough to send in.
Making transparency meaningful, that's a challenge we certainly all face. Being a member to the Pirate Party, I am a big proponent of transparency and accountability because it empowers us and the public, and knowledge is power. In fact, I'm currently suing the Commission over its refusal to disclose information on unethical and even illegal research and development of video lie detector technology. And the ruling is expected on Wednesday on that. And scientists can only deliberate these questionable technologies and their accuracy and their discriminatory impact if the technology and the results are out in the open. And also the media and parliaments can only deliberate this kind of intrusive technology if we know about it and if we have all the information that is necessary. So that's why I hope that this ruling will set a precedent and allow us to hold the EU accountable for the research it funds. But then knowing problems does not yet stop them. Transparency to me is a tool to change and improve the regulation. So we will need to come to exclusion of unethical technologies in the EU's research funding program. We will need to reform the ethics review process. So this is what transparency is about. It's a tool, it's a vehicle. And in a similar vein, the proposed Digital Services Act of the European Union has been drafted by liberal commissioners and has been welcomed by industry. And it's all about transparency, about self-auditing and co-regulation. So in fact, transparency seems to be the liberal answer to addressing the lack of respect for fundamental rights online. So let me look into where the proposed Digital Services Act transparency provisions can support fundamental rights. So there's a provision according to which information in the terms and conditions should be provided on any restrictions that are imposed in relation to the use of a service, as well as the main parameters for recommender systems. So I think this will be rather general language that we usually see in the terms. And as long as the users are not given a choice, or for example, interoperability of recommender systems, it is of limited value. What we are pushing for is that users would have a right to see their timeline in chronological order only, as Francis Hogan is also advocating for, but also giving users the right to use external algorithms of their choice, such as ones that are developed by the community. I think that would go a long way in addressing the problems these algorithms and content amplification creates. There is provision in the proposed Digital Services Act for a yearly transparency report by companies. So we'll see statistics on takedowns and data requests. That's kind of a standard procedure that is already in place for most companies. That will be mandatory. We'll also see a yearly report on upload filters with indicators of the accuracy and any safeguards applied. So this goes in the right direction. However, it's not exactly what Frances Hogan suggested. She said that you really need to break down the accurate statistics in country by country, because the filters work even less well for non-English language content. It regularly suppresses valuable content. She mentioned counter-terrorist content, but the same applies to media content, LGBTQI content, and all kinds of content that is filtered because these filters can't reliably tell right from wrong. So the information that is provided for in the Commission's proposal to a Digital Services Act may go some way, but it can only be the start of the discussion. Companies will also need to notify and give reasons for removing content. So the person that posted it will be given reasons and also some information on where to seek redress. That's of course useful and important because you can only challenge decisions if you know the reasons why they were taken. Viewers or users will be able to identify ads as well as the advertiser, and will have a right to know the main targeting parameters. There will also be a public ads database. So this certainly supports a public discussion that has repeatedly resulted in reforms and in corporations removing certain targeting mechanisms and criteria. Often it can still be circumvented, and it's not really sufficient to address the problems that come with the personalized targeting of content. It's a tool that, if used in elections and referendums, can actually be used to manipulate democracy, can be used for foreign interference, if messages are just designed in a way that appeals to the personality of the person reading them. It's not just something that a person can decide individually. Many people may not understand the implications of this kind of manipulation and the power of the data that can be mined from comprehensive online user profiles. Transparency will also not prevent manipulation from minors or by targeting very sensitive groups, such as based on the sexuality of a person, based on their religion, etc. pp. Then there is an obligation that large companies and otherwise an EU authority will publish a yearly report on systemic risks that have been reported by platforms, as well as best practices to address them. Now this sounds like a good thing, because this can sort of be part of a fundamental rights impact assessment. However, the legislation that mandates mitigating risks without specifying this could actually make things worse. Very worried about the collateral damage that companies may cause if they try themselves to address so-called systemic risks. Note that the legislation is about risks. It's not about actual impacts, about any adverse impacts. It's the mere risks that they want to address. I'm concerned that there is no democratic accountability in terms of these mitigation measures. There is no judicial oversight, and that is a kind of a Pandora's box that we are opening here. The key transparency provision that has been hailed a lot is a data access provision that would give access to vetted researchers in order to research systemic risks that the platforms are responsible for. The European Parliament, in its position that's just being adopted, wants to add here non-for-profit NGOs that should also be given access, and also wants to mandate the publication of the findings of the researchers, which is of course important improvements. And here again, publications on the algorithms that platforms use have repeatedly make them adjust their and correct their algorithms. So this is of value. But again, it doesn't mean that users will be given any choice when it comes to their timeline. So it may make the platforms adjust and improve on their algorithms. I'm not sure if they are aware of their own algorithms all the time. It seems to be very complicated. So to sum it up, I think Frances Haugen's leaks prove that a company like Facebook Meta keeps consistently prioritizing profits over the public good. But with the Digital Services Act, the EU keeps believing it can make big tech pursue a public interest agenda and sort of fix problems by itself. That's really naive at best, in my opinion. I think that transparency has a very valuable role in safeguarding our rights online, but it's not sufficient if we want the Digital Services Act to be a game changer when it comes to the surveillance capitalist business model that relies on pervasive monitoring of every online action, when it comes to error-prone censorship algorithms, or when it comes to the platform lock-in that we are encountering. So that's why in the run-up to the plenary vote on the European Parliament's position to the Digital Services Act, I'm calling for improvements, and we'll also see that amendments are tabled that will go beyond transparency and into the regulation of these platforms. What we need is a political will to put users and our democratic institutions in control of the digital age, rather than continuing to trust in multinational corporations to shape the digital era we and our children are living in. That said, I wish you a fruitful and hopefully successful discussion on how to make transparency meaningful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, MEP Breyer. So that was a member of the European Parliament, Patrick Breyer, who's the lead rapporteur from the Civil Liberties Committee of the European Parliament, sharing the latest on the Digital Services Act and what to expect next on all of these issues from the European Union. Before we kick into our first panel of the day, just a few housekeeping notes. This is day 2 of our 3-day Future of Speech Online event focused around the theme of making transparency meaningful. Yesterday, we heard a great overview about the many different kinds of transparency that are part of the ongoing tech policy conversation. CDT has actually just released a guide for policymakers laying out a framework for understanding how issues like transparency reporting, notice to users, third-party assessments, and researcher access to data all fit under the broad umbrella of transparency. And we also heard from experts and advocates about how to keep focused on different groups and communities of users to understand what kinds of information are necessary to actually empower users to navigate their information environments. If you missed yesterday's panel, the video from that event is available on CDT's YouTube page, and we can drop a link in the chat. And we also note that today's session is being live streamed and recorded and will be accessible via CDT's YouTube page going forward. So we can drop links to the chat in the chat to day 2's videos as well. If you have any questions for the organizers or any trouble with Zoom features, you can contact events@cdt.org. And during the panel discussions, folks are very welcome to submit questions either via Zoom's Q&A feature, or if you're listening along on the live stream, you can send in an email to questions@cdt.org or tweet at us using the hashtag CDT questions. So for today, we have a great agenda focused around issues of transparency reporting and user notification and due process. Our first panel will be all about reflecting on the Santa Clara principles. What can they achieve and what can't they? And we will also explain what they are if you're not familiar with them. We will then have a very short break starting just past the hour while we change over our speakers for the next panel. And we'll move on to the second session of the day, Building a Better Transparency Report. That will run to the end of the second hour of today's programming, but will be here at the same link that you used to join the first session. So if you're planning to attend both, please just sit tight when the first panel concludes. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first set of panelists to join me on the virtual stage. We have a great group of experts here to talk with you today. I'll do some quick introductions. First up is David Green. He's the Senior Staff Attorney and Civil Liberties Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He has extensive experience litigating First Amendment issues, including at EFF and in prior roles at the First Amendment Project, and served as the Program Director for the National Campaign for Free Expression. David was also the principal cat herder for the Global Civil Society Coalition to revise the Santa Clara Principles, which we'll be talking about shortly. Next, we have Connie Chung, who is the Senior Director of Global Policy for Trust and Safety at Twitch, the video streaming platform, where she leads the team setting global standards for healthy communities to grow and thrive. Connie has more than a decade of experience in online safety, including work at Twitter, Yahoo, NetSafe New Zealand, and Common Sense Media. Connie was also one of the chief architects of the innovative Twitch Safety Advisory Council that brings together streamers from the platform and outside experts to give advice and feedback to Twitch. And full disclosure, CDT is a member of the Twitch Safety Advisory Council. Then we'll be hearing from Julia Wono, who's the Executive Director of the Content Policy and Society Lab at Stanford University, where she is also a fellow of the Program on Democracy and the Internet. Julie is also the executive director of the digital rights organization Internet Sans Frontières, or Internet Without Borders, and one of the inaugural members of the Facebook Oversight Board, which I suppose is now the Meta Oversight Board. Julie is also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And then finally, we have Evelyn Dueck, who is an SJD candidate at Harvard Law School, a senior research fellow at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a visiting fellow at the Yale Information Society Project at Yale Law School. You may also recognize her as one of the co-hosts of the fantastic Lawfare podcast, Arbiters of Truth. So today we're talking about the Santa Clara Principles for transparency and accountability in content moderation, and more generally about the continually developing law and policy conversation about transparency and user notice and appeal, and what that frame really accomplishes in content governance and user empowerment, and maybe what that kind of frame for these issues leaves out. So yesterday we had a great overview courtesy of Rebecca McKinnon giving us sort of a quick history of transparency in the tech sector, looking back to issues with companies operating in China in the mid-aughts, where Yahoo, Google, and Microsoft faced congressional scrutiny about whether and how they were handing over data about their users to the Chinese government. We heard about Google releasing the first transparency report about government demands for user data in 2010 and sort of really starting a whole decade plus worth of discussion about this concept of transparency reporting. We saw that over the years after Google launched its first report, a few more companies joined in, but in particular, many joined the fray of transparency reporting after the Snowden revelations about US government surveillance. There's also been a big push from civil society all throughout that time for asking companies to do more reporting, not just on government demands for user data or content restriction, but also about how companies themselves moderate content under their terms of service or their community guidelines standards. So in 2018, a small group of NGOs, primarily from the US, got together to develop the original Santa Clara Principles. This was alongside a content moderation at scale conference that was organized by Professor Eric Goldman at Santa Clara University School of Law. That Como at Scale set of conferences, there were 3 in that year, 2018, are all available online and a really great thing to look at. They were a very interesting effort themselves at transparency. For the first time, I think, bringing together, over a dozen different companies to talk very publicly and on the record about their content moderation policies and practices and how they address different issues, and really giving people that opportunity to sort of compare and contrast across different kinds of companies. So the small coalition, which CDT and EFF were both a part of, launched at the second Content Moderation at Scale conference in May 2018 and laid out some strong recommendations around the kind of numbers, notice, and appeal opportunities that, that civil society was calling on companies to provide. We really tried to use these as an advocacy document, a rallying cry for civil society folks from around the world to say, these are concretely things that we want to see companies doing to improve people's awareness of what's going on services, and also to be able to kind of respond to what we're hearing from many users around the world about a lack of clarity or a lack of understanding of how they can control what's happening to their own speech on different services. And then just last week, we launched a revised set of the Santa Clara principles at the Internet Governance Forum. This is where I want to turn to David Green. So David, you've been deeply involved in what was a years-long process to revise the Santa Clara principles. Can you tell us a little bit about what that entailed? What were some of the major issues or challenges that came up when you were revising the Santa Clara principles?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and I'm really happy to be here and talk about this more. About 2 years ago, some of us we've been using a lot of people in this community in the advocacy community have been using the Santa Clara principles really as a touchstone and advocacy point, really just to try and some basis for assessing human rights. I don't even want to use the word compliance, but just sort of to what extent is there a human rights dimension to content moderation? And one of the concerns we started to have was that the original principles were written. It was sort of a spontaneous thing when this meeting happened adjacent to the Como at Scale conference that wasn't done with the purpose of having a set of principles, but really just arose out of the discussion. And it wasn't planned to be an inclusive group. It was just the people happened to be in the room. I actually was not among them. Not that that's an important omission, but one of the things we noticed as we were doing advocacy, we really started to question a few things. Was one, are these effective? I mean, we as advocates found them useful, but are they effective beyond our inner circle of advocates? And two, like how these things were such a product of the US and Europe thinking, like, do these have any relevance to the rest of the world at all? So one of the things we set out to do was really to find out whether the Santa Clara principles were useful, what they were missing, and how did the world at large feel about them. And so we embarked on a global open consultation process that really sought to get feedback from as many, I dare say the word stakeholders, people who just are interested, people who are affected by content moderation, which is pretty much everybody from around the world. Best laid plans, of course, with everything in 2020 got skewed a little bit when the pandemic started shutting down and moving to the virtual world. A lot of the conferences and things that we had planned to really organize a lot of in-person sessions to get feedback from around the world. But still, we felt like it was a really successful process. In addition to just having individuals and organizations just directly submit comments, we were able to have some group consultations happen by way of partners around the world. So group consultations in Latin America, in Africa, in India, in Europe, in the Americas more broadly. Really just people sitting around in a room for a few hours. We gave them a set of 13 questions to consider and having a very interactive conversation. All of these, we had about 40 submissions in total, representing, I believe it was 25 different countries. Really was really valuable and useful source of information. I think all of those of us who read them learned a lot about the process, and we did try and summarize a lot of things that were submitted in a report that we have published and is available on the Santa Clara Principles website at santaclaraprinciples.org. I think one of the lessons we learned, well, I can talk about this more, I don't know if you want me to do it now or later. There really were some overarching themes that emerged. But one of the things I think we learned, so the top message was that, yes, Santa Clara Principles, something like them has the ability to be very relevant. I think the other thing we learned was there are lots of different ways people think they can be relevant. I really saw the original Santa Clara principles as being really very user rights focused, really very much focused on, as an individual user, what information do I need to know in order to decide whether I want to use this service and how to use it in the way that I thought served me best. So for example, the notice provisions were very much designed to an individual user. It was very much focused on due process for that user, and they weren't particularly focused very much on getting data for research or regulatory purposes. In fact, I think they're very much a self-regulatory document, not a regulatory document. And I think one of the things in the comments that we really saw was at least the question being asked: are these most valuable as being user focused, or is there a larger or do we want to look at transparency more broadly as to what do we want to learn about this ecosystem in general? Do the Santa Clara principles have a role in bringing light to that type of information?
No, it's really interesting, David, and I definitely want to dig in more of that on that question of sort of what were the principles intended to be and what have they sort of morphed into, and then how that feeds into the kind of feedback that we were getting or what people kind of hope to use them. But I do also want to bring in next. So Connie, you've worked at on trust and safety and transparency issues at a couple of different user-generated content companies, including in your current role at Twitch. And so, kind of open question to you. David was just talking about wanting to assess the principles and see if they were useful. Are civil society advocacy efforts like the Santa Clara Principles useful to you in your role, working at a company and thinking about these issues? What has been useful about them, and what kinds of things do they seem to miss?
Yeah, and again, thanks, Emma, so much for the invitation to speak today. Happy to chat about this. So there are definitely useful, also definitely limits. I think on the positive, what I've seen with my professional life is that having principles and frameworks for trusted groups can be really useful for advocating internally. And it can also be useful for my team internally as acting as a check on our work, right? So I've been on super tight trust and safety teams, smaller groups, where you're expected to support the company and advocate for trust and safety in your work, right? But I think there's a risk of, this is going to sound like Connie's opinion if Connie just says this, right? And so sometimes when you're in a smaller group, having frameworks from trusted places means better support of your work, because you can say, look, there are all these other groups that also support these principles, and this is an important thing for us to consider as well. For keeping myself in check, I'm a really big fan of the book, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. I don't know if anyone's read that, but it's written by a surgeon who advocates for professionals to use checklists on routine things, right? Like that there's efficiency and safety because you have mental space freed up when all the routine things are written down. And so for policy, I think it's really helpful to have lists and principles to act like a sanity check, to make sure like explainability, clarity is something that we're thinking about, and not just that every single person in my team is always aligned and always thinking about the same principles all the time. And so that means building our own list from our own values within the company, but also using principles from outsiders that, again, we trust and we've tested before. And I think this really frees up creativity and deeper thinking within the work that we do. As far as limits, I think it depends on whether or not guidelines fit the operating principles of the company, right? So to use Twitch as an example, we are live streaming and we are interactive. And so you can stream and there's a back and forth between content creators and oftentimes the chat community on their stream. And for those who aren't familiar, we have a layered approach on Twitch for safety. So the first foundational layer is the community guidelines, right? Things that my team writes, the rules. And if you break those rules, then you might get kicked off or you might get suspended for a while from the company, from being able to use the service. But on top of that, we have a ton of tools for controlling your community. So we often hear from creators that they have really, really different communities with different needs. And so you can delegate moderators who control your chat. And we have automated tools that you can ramp up low or high to say, okay, you can hold words for reviews, or you can block people from participating. And with all these areas, you don't need justification or notice or process, right? You just get to do what is tailored for your community and do what's best. And so what ends up happening is really interesting, because you've got some creators who are just super heavy-handed with how they want to address their community, where they're like, I'm going to turn up every feature to the highest, and I don't want to deal with any of the people who I find unpleasant. And then you have people who take the time to listen, and even if it's someone is rude or an instigator, they say, okay, well, I think this person can be reformed, and I want to spend that time within my community to have them be a productive member. And so they use our tools a little bit less. And so the part of me that works on community guidelines loves principles and references for thinking about our work. And then the community moderation lover in me understands that I think procedural justice can sometimes have limits, particularly for smaller groups or when people really want to be nuanced. And so different companies operate on different sizes and models, and there are some that are much more community focused than ours. And so I think people want the flexibility to be able to make nuanced decisions, and they don't necessarily need transparency and rules as the first line of defense for that. It might be, I don't like your vibe, it doesn't fit within our community. And so I think these are the kind of things that we need to balance.
That's great. It's such an interesting perspective too, because while I'm sure there was some discussion about kind of different approaches to content moderation, in groups working on the Santa Clara principles, I myself didn't really ever think of them as necessarily guidelines for community involved moderators, right? Like people who were there. I could make an argument that, principles of letting people know what your rules are before you enforce them on them, those can apply across the board. But I think you are drawing out a really interesting point about how there is a real variety of ways that content moderation happens online, and any set of principles is going to have kind of fit some models better and others maybe less well. So I want to now bring in Julie as sort of kind of reflecting another potential audience for things like the Santa Clara principles, although not one that existed when the principles were first drafted. So Julie, you've worn many hats, including in civil society and academia, and now as a member of the Facebook or Meta Oversight Board. I'm wondering, from your perspective, on the board in particular, do civil society initiatives like the Santa Clara Principles make an impact? Do they kind of register with the board as you're doing your work? And how do you see them intersecting with the transparency goals that the board has itself?
Thank you very much, Emma. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation and part of this whole event. To respond very frankly, clearly to your question, yes, these initiatives by civil society organizations around transparency, accountability in the tech industry, and particularly in the content moderation space, are extremely important. Why? Well, because, and I'll try to link my different hats here. I really truly believe in the ability of the solutions that we want to bring into the challenges that we're facing on the internet in general. I really do believe that those solutions have to mirror the network itself. So the network is a network of networks, and there is a lot of interdependency, and there is no way that only one point of the network will find a solution to the whole network. So I really try to apply principles around multi-stakeholderism, how we can work together, include different publics in making policy that will apply to us all on those spaces and on social media particularly. And the oversight board is, I think, a very interesting try in that space. How can you make binding decisions that will be imposed to a company like Meta, and particularly to two of its companies, which are Facebook and Instagram? How do you make those binding decisions that are rights-based and that are also informed by inputs from different stakeholders? And the Santa Clara principles around transparency, I have to say, have been very helpful to many of our discussions. But I also would like to speak to the importance of these principles to exist in the first place and to start a conversation that is necessary to, I would say, try to fill the power imbalance that exists, really. when you're a company like Facebook or Meta, right, rather now, when you're a company like Meta, when you're a company like Twitter, when you're a company like Alphabet, and you hold so much information and you're trying to, well, say, okay, we will be more transparent, but you're talking to users who don't even know how your companies are organized. I am a civil society leader. It's only until I came to the Silicon Valley that I understood what trust and safety was, and that I even learned about the existence of such professions. It's only until I came that I knew the importance of talking to product, not only to public policy. So there is a real power imbalance. So I'm really comforted to see such initiatives that really put out there, information that are lacking to organizations, to users that cannot be in the Valley, that do not have access to the companies and do not have access to all this new knowledge. We have to remember that social media are accessible in societies where even the concept of transparent governance for governments does not exist. So if you want to talk transparency, you have to make sure that you are all talking the same language. And I'm really comforted by the fact that the V2 of the Center Clara principles really went out there to the world. And it's something that I hope also the Oversight Board can learn from. How can we learn more and understand more the challenges that are faced by communities that we don't know about yet, but that are facing kind of the future content moderation problems. And in most of the cases, they're not located in Europe or United States. So I wanted to really congratulate the conveners of these principles for showing the paving the way and showing the leading by example. So how do these principles intersect with the transparency work that the Oversight Board tries to do? So as a reminder, we make binding decisions on very individual cases. For instance, your content was taken down by Facebook, you can appeal to the Oversight Board. But beyond these individual cases, we make a lot of recommendations to Meta. According to Meta, we make too many recommendations. But what is important to know is that many of these recommendations are informed by the interactions that the Oversight Board has with external actors, including civil society organizations, and I would say even on top of the list, civil society organizations and academic institutions. We inform our recommendations and deliberations through this in interactions, but also through the readings. We read a lot of reports that are published by civil society actors. One example is, I don't know, well, obviously the Center Clara principles, but even beyond that, on the issue of transparency, one of the recommendations that the Oversight Board has made recently was around government request on content takedown. Most of these information were not public until now. And I'm thinking particularly of a case that we worked on, which involved it was a publication by Al Jazeera that was shared by a user and that was taken down by Facebook. And that publication was concerning the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And what we learned as the board during our deliberations is that through a report by organizations and by an organization called Slameh, sorry, I struggle with the name. It's spelled 7AMLHA, and I never know how to pronounce it, so I apologize. But that report informed the public and the board of the existence of a government unit that had direct access to content moderators, or at least to Facebook content teams, and that could request content takedowns. That information was not public, and we insisted and recommended while making the decision, we recommended to Meta and to Facebook to publish that information. And Facebook has agreed to include those information in its transparency efforts. So all this to say that yes to these initiatives, yes to having more conversations about these and explaining more of these concepts that are very new and that are trying to deal with challenges that probably don't even exist yet. But more of these are very important, and they definitely help organizations and institutions such as the Oversight Board, well, do their work better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And now I want to bring in Evelyn. So Evelyn, your scholarship focuses on online speech regulation and platform governance, and you've written a lot about transparency, including in your work on content cartels and on how platforms report about information operations. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you see things like the Santa Clara Principles fitting into the broader policy debates around content governance?
Thanks, Emma. And I also want to just take an opportunity to thank you for your work and advocacy in this context as well. You're one of the most persuasive and ardent advocates for the things that we're talking about today, and I think it's so important. And thanks to everyone that worked on version 2 of the Santa Clara Principles. I think they're a really fantastic document, and it's really exciting to see the development of nuance and greater detail in building out the original documents. As David said, I think the greater focus on like systems and data access and things beyond those individual, notice, appeal requirements centered around what the individual users need is really, really important. And I really think that the note in the chapeau and throughout sort of all of the commentary that these are not a model for regulation is really, really important. And I'll come to why in a second. But in some sense, I think the Santa Clara Principles version 1, at least, were a victim of their own success, right? They became kind of seen as this gold standard of like a baseline of what people should want from content moderation and from platforms when they're taking down user content. And even though they weren't intended to be a note for regulators, they got picked up by regulators a lot, and they got picked up as a persuasive kind of idea of the ideal of due process. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think it's quite easy to legislate, right? Like there's a lot of really difficult trade-offs in this context versus speed, accuracy, legitimacy, prioritization, different contexts. But it's so easy to say, hey, if you want to take down a piece of content, give your user notice, reasons, and right of appeal, right? That's a very easy thing to draft, and it's very easy to ding platforms for not doing that. And I think it's also sort of intuitive. When we're talking about speech, that's what it looks like when we're talking about speech in international human rights law, when we're talking about constitutional First Amendment speech litigation, right? That's the kind of things that we really prioritize as legitimate when the government is taking down speech. And so it feels right to import it online, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's sort of a good fit. And I think that the speed and scale of content moderation online really distinguishes it from the offline model, and the fact that it's private platforms taking down content rather than the government. I think we need to engage more closely with the trade-offs that are involved there. I think that it's been really important progress to get more transparency from these companies, but I think we're starting to learn that these like transparency reports that get produced quarterly or biannually can often obscure more than they illuminate. Like there's these huge numbers that like, oh wow, they're doing so well, they're taking down all of this fake stuff, but if you dig in, we don't know the denominators, we don't know the accuracy rates, we don't know the reasons for trends. Is there just simply more content online rather than there being more diligent? Those kinds of things. It creates the perverse incentives to take down more content, and there's sort of no really vocal voice for countering that. Like governments are like, yes, we made them take down more content, and platforms are like, yes, we took down more content. And often what gets lost in that is that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think it really sort of incentivizes like the idea that if there's something wrong with content moderation, we can fix it by adding more due process, right? More process always is better. And I think we do see this reflected in like the Oversight Board's opinions as well, and regulators as well. It's like if there's errors, surely we can fix that by just giving users a little more notice and a little more reasons and a little more explanation and more appeal rights. And let's make sure that every piece of content goes to a human. And we will all think it's more legitimate and trust these things more if we just keep piling on. Like if there's something wrong, it must be that we don't have enough process. That's oversimplifying the argument, but I do think that that's kind of the tenor of these debates. And I think those are all empirical assumptions that we need to test. It's not necessarily clear to me that a user does think a decision against them is more legitimate if they get a really long page of reasoning, or if it takes an extra 2 days to get their decision to them because it needed to go through all of this extra process and things like that. So I'd really love to see sort of more testing of those assumptions, and sort of I think that like I said at the top, the focus on moving to the systems level and thinking about system design and ex ante system design is really, really valuable. for. And I guess I just think that maybe should be where we are focusing our priority and resources, and sort of the capital, right? Both the business private capital of where they devote their resources, but also the political capital, right? Like, we only are really probably going to get one bite at the apple every 20 years on this. And so what do we really think is going to make a difference in this context? And I'm sort of, I've been invited on this panel, I think, to play the Grinch, which is often the role that I play. And I'm sort of skeptical about that.
Well, one of the friendliest and most cheerful Grinches out there, Devlin. But no, I mean, I think that's an excellent segue. And just a reminder to our attendees, we do have a Q&A function. We will turn to audience questions shortly. But Evelyn, I do think you tee up like such an important kind of reflection on this. So we've been talking about, and David framed the original Santa Clara Principles as very much a conversation about that kind of individual user rights and user empowerment perspective. And I've got kind of a general question for folks on, just kind of open to anyone, on what you actually think is necessary for real user empowerment here. You know, we've obviously, a lot of us are pitching that transparency and some information is part of that, but like, is that enough? Probably not. What else do we need to be looking at? But so please take either that question and or this other one about how to balance that sort of that focus on the traditional user rights framework versus other ways of thinking about sort of platform accountability, or what are the systems in play here? What are the kinds of things, whether it's from Julie, your role as being part of the emerging structure of governance around at least one particular platform, or Connie, you actually working at a company, when you hear kind of calls for more transparency about the systems that are in play, what does that sound like from your perspective? So sort of open it up. Anybody who'd like to jump in, please do. Yeah, Julie.
Yes, thank you, Emma. I think the two questions are not mutually exclusive. Sorry, my lighting is terrible. Don't know what's happening, but I'm here, I'm talking. It's not a deep fake, I promise. So the two questions are not mutually exclusive. So actually, what I mean by that is, what is needed for transparency to be more useful to users, or what else is needed? As a general, as an introduction, I would like to stress the importance of finally embedding content moderation, content governance as a whole, in a language that's informed by rule of law and democracy. Right now, my biggest frustration, and I apply it to myself too, is that we have been talking a very expert jargon, but I think it's also important to translate that into a language that many around the world understand, and that is the rule of law. When two companies disagree on their policies, for instance, or let's say one group is considered dangerous on one platform and not considered dangerous on the other platform, what does that mean as a whole for the ecosystem? What does that mean from a rule of law perspective? Is that a conflict of law? Should we resolve this? Is that even a problem? I don't know. These are questions that we should be asking, and that's related to transparency. But for that, we need to make sure that we're all talking the same language. And right now, and I'm linking to some of the remarks that I said earlier, I am not sure that all users around the world really understand that what they're facing, first of all, is a content moderation problem, and that transparency, what that is even, can be helpful to solve that. So there is a role for us as organizations to play in disseminating that message, or rather starting those conversations with going beyond the digital rights realm, going to speak to children's rights organizations, speaking to women's rights organizations, speaking to disabled rights organization. I mean, everyone who uses social media platforms. And to your second question, which was around, should we do that, or should we do more of accountability? It's both are necessary. If we are moving towards a way where content governance is becoming, or is, a democratic issue and should be governed by rule of law principles. Rule of law imposes checks and balances, so that is very important for accountability. Well, the Oversight Board is one example. There's certainly many others. And also disclosure, transparency are also extremely important. So to respond to your question, there is a lot of education needed. We need to transition from hot takes to rule of law when we talk about content governance and content moderation specifically. And both transparency and accountability are important within that conversation.
I think I can try and just jumping off of what Julie has said. I view the Santa Clara principles and similar documents as being, I don't even say necessary, but useful, but certainly not sufficient. And I think there are, in some ways, a user rights focused approach really only works in a model where users can respond to the information they have and make choices. And one of those choices might be to seek out another service. But if they don't actually have a choice of another service, then all the information they have doesn't do well. So I think that the larger ecosystem, I think, also needs to really seriously think about how users are better served by a system with greater options, with greater portability, with greater interoperability. And things like that, to be user focused. In some ways, the Santa Clara principles as a user focused document really will work much better in an ecosystem where there's real user choice. In terms of sort of the larger sort of systematic, what does transparency teach us about just this ecosystem generally, and how we operate in what's the best way to operate. And what's the best way to operate in it? I think it can tell us, it can help us negotiate a system that is dominated by a few large players. But again, it doesn't get us the whole way there. So I'll go with useful, but not sufficient in and of themselves.
Just the one thing I'd probably add on top of that is I think it's really important for us to hold our moderation systems accountable. And it's also important, I think, as users to advocate for effective tools for controlling your own experience, right? So that means if you're making content, giving controls for who can participate and interact with you. And if you're on the viewer side, maybe limiting. So if you don't want to see certain things, you don't have to see certain things. And I think that's because safety and tolerance and expression can feel really personal. And so I think the more you give people the tools to control their own experience, the less you need interventions and the less you need the companies to step in. And we've seen that a lot at Twitch.
Just to say, I really think that user empowerment and giving some power back to users to control their own content moderation experience can be a really effective way. If we're talking about moderating at scale, going back to users can be really important. And I think this focus on user empowerment is great. But I want to highlight, and I don't have an answer to this, that there is somewhat of a tension if we want to talk about importance of content moderation to democracy. Empowering individual users for them and their rights isn't necessarily going to fix what we think about as systems. For example, it of course doesn't see all of the people that aren't on the platforms but are fundamentally affected by the platforms. It also creates funny incentives, right? So one of my favorite stats is from the Oversight Board's first annual report, or its reports, where you see the number of appeals that it gets from people whose own content was taken down, vastly exceeds the number of appeals that it hears from somebody else that wants somebody else's content taken down, right? And you can see that that's a very reasonable thing to happen, because someone's interest in their own content is going to motivate them a lot more to go through this appeals process and get it taken down, get it put up, rather than sort of at some point you're going to be whatever, Bob can tweet that. And so, but if we're thinking about systemic issues and effect on society and culture, it's not necessarily clear that relying on individual users to be the people that surface those systemic issues are going to create exactly the kind of system that we want. So again, there's always these trade-offs between what are you really focusing on.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think that also leads us right into that question of who then makes the standards for the evaluation of systems. One nice thing about the user empowerment and sort of user-centric focus is that it's on the individual to kind of advocate on their own behalf according to what, if they feel that there's been an injustice, versus evaluation of the system as a whole against, I would say, let's start from human rights principles, but I'm not exactly sure where that points us for evaluation of, systematic application of a company's rules across all the content on their platform, or is the notice and takedown process, working sufficiently well? I think that's probably something that's going to have to get developed through pretty quickly as countries around the world are looking at putting in regulation that does take more of this systematic focus. I did want to ask one of the questions that we've gotten in from an audience member who's asking a good question about this kind of concept of who's the audience for transparency reports. So they asked, do you think that companies are publishing transparency reports really just for the governments and not for the users, because of how most of the data in the report shows the increase in content takedown over time, and isn't really focusing on incidents about how things actually happen or when serious incidents occur online? So it's sort of a point in the form of a question, but I'd love to get kind of any reactions from the panelists about this whole question of audience for transparency reports.
It's a good question. I was sort of waiting to see if Connie would unmute first, but I don't know that they're particularly useful to individual users. I mean, they're especially in the jargon in which they're written in. I don't know that an individual user gets a whole lot out of them. I do think as a civil society member, as an advocate, I find I learn something from them, but I actually really hope that researchers and academics actually learn a lot more from them and can translate into them. I guess not, based on evidence. I sort of hope they're not written for governments. Like I really hope that's not the audience, and I especially hope that's not the audience in the governments that are perhaps less accountable. I don't want to say non-democratic governments, because I don't think it actually correlates to democracy necessarily, or oppressive, whatever the word that is, for governments that are going to be quicker to regulate without the interests of their people in mind. I really hope it's not being written for that purpose. I don't actually think that leads to a good result if it is. So, but I am interested from companies' perspective what they think their audience is.
So I can speak to, I think, first and foremost, how do I put this? So for Twitch, people are really, really into transparency. This is one of the first things I realized when I first joined there. And I think a lot of that is because we are part of the creator economy, right? And so a lot of the creators make money, whether it's full-time or part-time, from their participation on Twitch. And so as soon as I started getting questions where people all the time were like, can I do this? Can I do this? Is it important? Is this against the rules? It's not against the rules. And I think it's because if you get caught in a policy, it has a really far-reaching effect on your life, right? You're cut off from a source of revenue. And so we treat these decisions super, super seriously. And one of the first policy launches that we worked on, we spent a lot of time researching. We're like, okay, I think this is where we're going to draw the line, and we're going to test this out with user experience research and see if people feel like this is transparent enough, people feel like this is comprehensive. And we talked to a number of creators, and the theme over and over again wasn't like, oh, this is where you need to draw the line, or this is where important where you draw the line. They're just like, can you please explain very, very clearly what the line is and where we're going to go from there? And so that has been a super big motivation for us, I think, to be as transparent as possible from a lot of different ways, right? So after that, with our community guidelines and other things, we started writing, putting in more examples, putting in more clarity. And a lot of that has been the motivation, I think, for our transparency report too, where our creators are super interested in the numbers that we take down and how they're affected by these policies and who is, because they feel like this is going to affect their livelihood in some ways.
So I see that we are coming up to the end of the hour, and I know at least one of our panelists has to drop quickly. So unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of the questions in the audience Q&A, but I did want to ask for our panelists kind of final reflections. So transparency was a really hot issue in 2021. It's probably going to be so coming up in 2022. What is one thing either that you're looking forward to or think can be accomplished coming up in the new year, or at least one thing you would really like policymakers to be considering seriously as the big tech policy making machine turns on in the next year? And Julie, I'll come to you first.
Thank you very much, Emma. I guess one thing that I hope we'll be able to do more in 2022, and specifically companies, is talk more to the user and explain more who you are, how you work, how you function, what are your content moderation processes. This is important, especially if we're in a time when companies want to regain trust from their user base after all the scandals that we've heard. So I think that would be speaking more to users and explaining more what you're doing and what you're not doing.
Connie?
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's like a Ted Lasso fan, but there's this one episode where I was trying to think about the summary, but Ted Lasso was like talking to one of his assistant coaches, and he's like, "Oh, therapy didn't work for me," and his assistant coach is like, "Different, but all people are different people, right?" And I feel kind of the same. As I've been thinking about this panel and thinking about all these things, like all communities are different communities, all companies are different companies, and I think it's going to take a lot of effort and it's going to be hard, but to standardize or to come up with the best principles is important and going to take a lot of work, I think, from all those spaces. And so, but I think we're better off from being able to appreciate that diversity.
Evelyn, how about you? What are you looking forward to in 2022?
I mean, the easy answer, I think, is that there's a number of sort of proposals in bills and legislation around the world to get researcher access to data, to create safe harbors for companies that want to provide independent researchers with access to underlying data, and safe harbors for the researchers using that data, because we just can't fix problems that we don't understand. So it's fantastic to sort of talk in the abstract about these questions of like trade-offs between speed and accuracy and, you know, appeal rates and all those sorts of things. But I mean, we can't answer those questions without actually knowing what's going on. I think that the big thing that the whistleblower revelations possibly showed is that there's so much more information inside than outside. I mean, we all knew that, but it confirmed it and made it really, really stark. And so the easy ask, the lowest hanging possible fruit, I mean, the fruit is basically sitting on the floor, is to say, let's crack these companies open and see if we can sort of get the empirical basis for smarter regulation.
That's great. And David, last thoughts from you.
Yeah, I'm actually not really looking forward to regulation, but let me just say that I do just want to use my last time I'm actually looking forward to maybe seeing how the foundational principles set out in the new Santa Clara principles, and how those get implemented by the companies. And this was one of the big changes, is that we added these foundational principles over what were now sort of the old operational principles of number, notice, and appeal. And these very quickly are human rights and due process, understandable rules and policy, cultural competence, which I think was probably the loudest thing we heard from international commentators, more focus on information about the state involvement and concern about state involvement in content moderation, and then integrity and explainability. I'd love to see those principles and those concerns reflected in transparency reports. And so my Pollyannish hope for 2022 is that the first one I read in 2022 will at least show some consideration of those ideas.
Yeah, and thank you so much for flagging those the foundational principles, David. Like, I think we could do an entire, probably 2-hour-long panel just on what does cultural competence look like in content moderation. So maybe mark your calendars for next year. We have another conversation all about that. But thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and everything with us today. We are now going to take a very short 1 or 2 minute break as we welcome our next panelists onto the virtual stage. So for all of our attendees, please sit tight and join us for the second panel on building a better transparency report, which will be starting soon. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caitlin Bogus, the Deputy Director of CDT's Free Expression Project, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our second panel on day 2 of the Future of Speech Online. This panel is called Build a Better Transparency Report, and we're going to be hearing from 3 experts in the field of transparency reporting to discuss some of the major components of transparency reports, the trends and opportunities in reporting, and the challenges of providing transparency reports as well. Before we do that, just a few housekeeping notes. I do want to remind our audience that we have we'll save time for questions at the end of today's panel. And so if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function if you're joining us through the Zoom webinar, or you can also tweet questions at us using the hashtag CDT questions, or you can email us questions as well at questions@cdt.org. I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. We will be hearing from first Guy Berger, who is the Director for Freedom of Expression and Media Development at Unesco, where he leads much of Unesco's work at the intersection of digital issues and free expression. Among other issues, Guy has worked on a study called Balancing Act, Countering Digital Disinformation While Respecting Freedom of Expression. He's also worked on the development of indicators for Unesco's concept of internet universality, as well as reports on world trends in freedom of expression and media development. And as perhaps most relevant to today's panel, a recent issue brief on transparency and accountability of internet platform companies. We're also joined today by Charlotte Wilner, who is the Executive Director at the Trust and Safety Professional Association, a forum for trust and safety professionals to connect with a network of peers, find resources for career development, and exchange best practices for navigating challenges unique to their profession. She also leads the Trust and Safety Foundation Project. And Charlotte began her career at Facebook, where she led international user support and then built out the first safety operation teams, before going on to build and lead Pinterest's trust and safety operations team before joining TSPA and TSF. And finally, we'll be hearing from Richard Wingfield. Richard is head of legal at Global Partners Digital, where he oversees the organization's legal, policy, and research function, building the organization's understanding of the application of international law to internet and digital policy, developing its policy positions, and monitoring trends and developments across the world. Richard also oversees GPD's engagement in key legislative and legal processes at the national, regional, and global levels, as well as its engagement with the tech sector. And before we dive in to hear from our panelists, I did want to just have a quick poll to share with the audience to get some feedback from you, for those of you who are participating in our Zoom webinar, on how you see transparency reports and what you think some areas for improvements and changes might be in the future. So I've just put out a poll to our audience with 3 questions. The first is, how often do you read tech company transparency reports? Choices are never, sometimes, often. Second question, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Transparency reports provide information that helps shed light on how tech companies operate. And then third question, which of the below topics that aren't covered in current transparency reports would you like to see included in future transparency reports? And there are 3 choices here: algorithmic transparency reports, human content moderation reports, and government content removal transparency reports. And this is for our audiences to weigh in, and then we'll talk about it with our experts on the panel as well. So I'll just leave a few more seconds for folks to add their responses to this poll. Don't be shy. Okay, I'm going to close it up in 2 more seconds. Last chance. Okay, I will share the results. All right, so in response to our first question, how often do you read tech company transparency reports? We've got a fairly engaged audience with transparency reports. I suppose that should be no surprise given the topic of today's session, with about 50% reading them sometimes and 31% often. Agree or disagree? We have transparency report optimists in the audience. Most of the audience agrees that transparency reports provide information that sheds light on how tech companies operate. And then for our final question on what else you'd like to see covered in current transparency reports, There is a large focus on government content removal, but not coming in not too far behind. We have algorithmic transparency reports too. And then a few folks said, or one folk said that they would like to see something else. So if that was you and you want to share in the chat what you want to see, please feel free to do that. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to turn now to our panel to get them to weigh in on this really interesting and important topic regarding transparency reporting. So I'm going to go first to Richard to maybe give us an overview of the current transparency reporting landscape. So can you tell us, Richard, what transparency reports are out there, who's publishing them, and then also who's involved in the efforts to improve transparency reports and those types of processes as well?
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and it's really wonderful to be joining you all to talk about this. And I think if you ask the first part of your question, looking at the transparency landscape in terms of which companies or which organizations are producing transparency, Access Now have a really helpful set of indicators which each year tracks the number of companies that are producing some kind of transparency. And looking at it earlier today, I think it's just shy of 100 now, so sort of between 80 and 90 companies, mostly in the global north. So we're really looking at companies based in the US and Europe and other parts of the global north producing some kind of transparency. And predominantly, we're seeing large online platforms, particularly social media companies, some telcos as well, and other companies that either collect data or receive requests for data from government in some way. So, cloud servicing providers, for example. The type of transparency that we're seeing is often quite rudimentary, though, and I think it sort of largely distills into two main categories. The first is really for social media companies and perhaps search as well, looking at content removal. So how many pieces of content are removed under a particular policy, maybe some data about whether those requests come from users or come from some governments or court orders. The second is more related to requests for personal data. So law enforcement and other security and other government agencies often want access to the data that these companies have, particularly if they're based in jurisdictions where they want data from those people that they don't have because they're not within the country itself. So often these transparency reports will produce raw numbers of the number of requests they get from different government agencies in different countries around the world. We have seen a trend over the last year or two to develop a little bit more, I guess, qualitative data. So you're seeing Facebook, for example, now Meta, talking a little bit more about its policies and how they're enforced during particular situations. And you're seeing a lot of that data now broken down in quite a granular level. So maybe even by every 3 to 6 months rather than annually, broken down by country as well. To come on to the second part of your question, what initiatives are we seeing? Well, there are quite a lot. Obviously, companies themselves are looking to refine the transparency reports that they produce each year. But as has been noted, I think in previous sessions, we're also seeing regulation now come in. So the EU, the UK, both through legislative vehicles, will be demanding greater transparency from companies themselves. And that will focus, I think, a lot more on the qualitative information, the kind of systems and processes and algorithms, rather than raw numbers of content removals. But we're also seeing initiatives in other places. The Santa Clara principles have been mentioned earlier, I believe in the previous session, which sort of bring an up-to-date set of expectations from civil society and human rights groups as to what transparency should be seen. And we're seeing more focused multi-stakeholder spaces look at particular issues. So, for example, the OECD has recently undertaken an exercise to develop a framework for transparency reporting on terrorist and violent extremist content. And there's similar work going on at the GIFCT and its transparency working group, again, with a focus on transparency around terrorism and violent extremism. So there's a lot going on, so plenty to chat through over the next 45 minutes or so, I hope.
Absolutely. Thanks, Guy, so much for providing that. Thanks, Richard, for providing that background for us. I do want to go now to Guy to ask you, Guy, about the UNESCO Transparency Reporting Initiative that it launched with the publication of its recent report, Letting the Sunshine In. Can you tell us why UNESCO is interested in transparency reporting and a little bit more about what the report is about and how you are going to carry this work on transparency reporting forward at UNESCO?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting us. So I just posted the link in the chat to this report, which is called Let the Sun Shine In. And this comes from UNESCO, which people may know is part of the UN. So 193 states are members of UNESCO. Why does the UN get interested in these issues? Well, particularly at UNESCO, we're interested, of course, in this question of culture, communications, and what's happening to freedom of expression, access to information, and so on. And at the same time, the UN is a sort of custodian of human rights and also of the view that all the private sector has to respect human rights. So part of human rights, of course, is access to information. And so in the realm of governments, what we do at Unesco is we promote that government should do proactive disclosure, but also be responsive to requests. And I guess you could say that this sort of then applies also to the private sector. And within that bigger picture, transparency reports are part of the game. Of course, the bigger picture is access to data, which is there is some data in the transparency reports, but there's a bigger question of access to data through APIs and so on. And ultimately, I think the interest is in making it redundant for people to have to ask for information and data, because it's in the transparency reports and or in APIs which are available to certain actors. So the reason why we got involved with this now and did this report is because in the UN there's a kind of an attempt to set standards. So the UN, adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's a standard. And so our ambition here is to have a standard for transparency. And the idea is really that this could be a standard for self-regulation. It could be a standard for governmental regulation as well. And what's in this are fairly high-level principles, which could be something that can give guidance both to companies and also the
I think
through the consultative process we had with this in developing these high-level principles, we got quite a lot of buy-in from the companies. So it's a question, of course, what does it mean more concretely? And I think about that just now. But just to tell you, for example, there's clearly this kind of standard what you'd expect. But we've put in these high-level principles that there should be disclosure about third-party assessments, about human rights compliance, so that if this kind of stuff is not leaked. There should be in a transparency report what risk assessments have been conducted, for example, with elections. And then also there should be disclosure about terms and conditions and amounts for money that's spent for research, education, and lobbying for advocacy. So I think that's all quite useful stuff to understand and make more accountable use of private sector power in this particular space. And if at a normative level, this report is followed with more specific indicators as opposed to the high-level principles, then I think we've got instruments that people can also use and companies themselves can use to structure the way that they practice transparency.
Thanks so much, Guy. And thanks for sharing the link as well. I really recommend people check out the report. In addition to the great principles that it lays out, it also gives a background on transparency reporting as well, a very thorough one, and talks about some of the history and also issues that have arisen in transparency reporting so far. So it's extremely informative. And I know we'll be talking more later in the panel about issues around standardization and voluntary frameworks versus kind of government regulation. So lots to dig into there. Charlotte, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You have a lot of experience working in trust and safety now at the TSPA and formerly at the tech companies. So in your experiences, what are the challenges and opportunities that tech companies confront when they're thinking about transparency reporting, and what are they talking about when they're implementing transparency reports?
This is my favorite question. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And it's wonderful to see all these names in the attendee list. I'm like, oh, it's good to see you here. I miss you. Let's all get together again sometime. So great group to be talking with. There are a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities from sort of the tech company perspective. And I had the opportunity, of course, to work at a company, actually two companies that started quite small and ended up fairly large. And there are some challenges that I think are universal, regardless of the size of the company or even how long they've been around. And I know we're going to be talking about standardization a little bit, or maybe a lot. Standardization, I think, is one of the challenges, simply because as Richard, you mentioned earlier, there are maybe 80, 100 companies right now who produce these reports. And each one of those companies has really different definitions of what it means when a piece of content is removed, acted upon, left up, taken down. Companies haven't agreed whether they report on number of requests for removal they've received or number of pieces of content that have been removed. What does removal mean in a world where maybe there is no content, it's just behavior? We start to get into the metaverse. So there's a lot of I think fundamental storytelling challenges that we have as an industry. Fundamentally, we want these reports to be useful, not just for our audiences, but actually for ourselves, frankly, as practitioners. We would like really clear understanding of what's happening in these ecosystems, but the numbers don't tell the story alone. And so there's a lot of, I think, really interesting challenges around how do we define what is meaningful as a metric, and how do we then tell that story to ourselves and to sort of broader audiences. Connie mentioned earlier, all companies are different companies, and I think that's just very true in this particular realm. The other thing I think we think a lot about is operational cost. So transparency reports aren't automatic, and it would be amazing if they were, right? But in a lot of places, perhaps even most companies still, a lot of this is tracked in like Google Docs and forms and stuff manually by people who don't necessarily have a system that's, recording all of this and logging it, and we'll go back later and look. So there's this intense operational cost, sometimes even gathering the data. There's then this operational cost associated with interpreting the data and putting it out in a form that is interpretable by the public. Even this question, I think one of the earlier speakers had talked about, well, how many pieces of content were removed for X policy? Well, that sounds straightforward, but often the way that's logged, as an example, is if something was taken down in this type of report queue versus that type of report queue. But many practitioners are under instructions, very reasonably for operational reasons, to remove a piece of content if it violates any policy. So something could be reported in through hate speech, and you say, well, it doesn't violate our hate speech rules, but it's definitely very naked, so we're going to remove it. That would perhaps get logged as a hate speech removal and not a nudity removal, unless you're doing extra work on the back end to make sure that one report is logged correctly. So there's just a lot of day-to-day machinery mechanics that really have a deep influence on the way that these reports are then populated and assembled. And those are the types of challenges we talk a lot about at TSPA and with our members, is how do you sort of structure yourselves from the beginning in a way that makes those decisions easier and makes that story easier to tell.
Thanks, Charlotte. And your example reminds me of a great blog post by one of our speakers from yesterday, Daphne Keller, who has a post, I think, called Some Humility about transparency, where she links to a Google Doc that she's made trying to think of all the ways you could count these types of issues differently when you're doing transparency reporting on them. If you get several reports about the same piece of content being removed, should you count that removal multiple times or just one time, et cetera? And it can get very complicated very quickly. So absolutely. You also mentioned, Charlotte, when you were talking that, we want these reports to be useful. And I think that raises the question, useful for whom? And that was something that came up on the previous panel too. Who is the audience for transparency reports? And in the previous panel, I think that some of the panelists expressed skepticism that users could find transparency reports useful, but maybe they'd be more useful for governments or for researchers or academics or civil society who's looking at these numbers. So for any of the panelists who maybe want to tackle this question, who do you see as the main audience for transparency reports? And do you think the information in transparency reports now is useful for that audience, or how would you change it for different audiences? Anyone want to tackle that?
I'm happy to jump in.
Sure, go first, Guy, and then we'll come to you, Charlotte.
Well, I think that what's important is who's it useful to. I think it's useful to, it's useful in principle, even if nobody reads the report. The fact that people are putting out their wares in a way, and maybe they instrumentalize it for public relations purposes in many cases, I'm sure. But nevertheless, I think that in itself, it's an exercise in public accountability, even if it's not taken up. But of course, I think ideally one wants to make this useful for users. And by users, I don't only mean individual users. Elections regulators, for example, they want they need to know what's happening in terms of electoral advertising, for example. I mean, that's really important. For UN bodies, it's really important to know, for example, that momentum is building and there's certain whistles that are dog whistles being blown, and that these can culminate in really dangerous speech. And the same with disinformation and so on. Now, that's why I say the transparency reports one's also got to couple with this whole question of transparency for whom and access through other mechanisms such as, CrowdTangle or APIs, because this stuff is really important for people who have to deal with the consequences, and who, instead of having to pick up the pieces or try and clean up the mess afterwards, with greater transparency could, I think, be more proactive at the start of the process.
Charlotte, would you like to share your thoughts?
So I was just going to add that from our perspective, one of the big audiences for these reports is actually employees at other tech companies, which is not, of course, the sort of intended or main audience, I think, when people are writing, but we're still very much in, I think, the nascent stage of people figuring out what transparency reports should look like. And there are a number of companies who, of course, have been doing this for many years. They're always putting out more and more really great stuff. But there's a lot of companies who are like, ooh, I just put out like one before, and I want to see like what else should I be thinking about. And that's true not just from a reporting perspective, where people want to understand, okay, how should we be sort of presenting this information publicly? It's also sometimes about understanding, like, in how do people do their trust and safety business, right? Okay, watching a company saying, we're getting these types of removal requests and here's how we respond, or we get these types of user reports, or here's how we do something proactively. That can be really informative for trust and safety professionals in other places to say, well, it looks like they've been able to figure out how to manage this in a particular way. Let's learn more about that approach, because that's something we are struggling with. And of course, it's hard to go up and say, hey, excuse me, do you have this problem? We do too. But that's something TSPA tries to help with. But the transparency report is really a big part of that, is you can really kind of get a little peek behind the curtain and say, all right, let me see if we can maybe learn something to improve our own practice here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had not thought about the other tech companies being a potential audience for the transparency reports, but that makes a lot of sense. Richard, Charlotte talked earlier about some of the trade-offs that get talked about inside companies when they're thinking about transparency reporting. And I know that you've been deeply involved in some of the voluntary processes that you talked about earlier regarding improving transparency reports, like the Santa Clara Principles and the OECD. And I'm wondering, when those groups are talking about transparency reports and how to make them better, what types of trade-offs are you considering and discussing as you're debating what sorts of recommendations or frameworks to come up with?
Yeah, so there's a couple of sort of really big themes that I think have seen emerge at a number of the different forums that we've been looking at. And one, which we've sort of touched upon a little bit already, is the aim of transparency to try to get the largest companies to do transparency better because they have the largest market share and the most impact? Or do we want to try and get more companies to be doing transparency, particularly small and medium-sized companies? So the more detailed and demanding you make, guidance for what transparency should look like, it may well push the bigger companies to do better, but it will exclude and in many ways put off smaller companies from doing any transparency at all because the standards they're being held to are just too high. So are you trying to achieve better transparency from a small number of companies or some transparency from a larger number of companies? I think a second trade-off that we've seen from time to time, and sort of again relates a little bit to what's been said, is how standardized do you want to get? Because you can have a very broad set of kind of principles that apply to all companies within scope, ICT related companies that allow users to generate content or which have a relationship with user data in some way. But if they're very generalized, then you give a huge amount of discretion to companies, and it's very difficult to compare and contrast. And that's often one of the aims of research for governments, is to be able to try and see how companies are doing compared to each other. The trouble is, the more specific you get and the more kind of granular and detailed you get as to precisely what the transparency should look like, you come up against Charlotte's problem, which is that all of these companies are doing things very differently, have different business models, and success may well look very differently for different companies, even if they're doing what seemingly from the outside look like very similar things. Through this process, we've also seen some really interesting trade-offs as well, which sort of suggests that there is a balance between transparency and effectiveness in dealing with the actual problems that are being caused or being concerned. So yes, you can spend a lot more of your company's money on better transparency, but that might be money that's now no longer spent on content moderators or more accurate systems for dealing with it. You might well be able to say, well, we're going to publish much more transparent data about the organizations and the individuals that we're monitoring and whose content we prioritize, but you then alert them to what you're doing. And so they might be minded then to try to find ways around your rules. So there are often those sort of unexpected trade-offs between transparency and actually effectiveness of dealing with things like disinformation, terrorism, hate speech, or what you're actually, as a government regulator or civil society group trying to stop.
Yeah, and we've talked now about trade-offs within companies, being discussed within companies, trade-offs and these kind of civil society efforts. I wanted to turn to thinking about the government and regulators. And Guy, you mentioned earlier that the UNESCO report, Letting the Sun Shine In, the principles there could be potentially useful to regulators who are thinking about mandating transparency reports. And we've seen a lot of governments around the world who are coming up with legislative proposals to require transparency reporting. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are the most important things you think that governments and regulators need to understand when they're thinking about transparency reports?
So this is, of course, a complex thing because it comes down to the power of governments and whether governments respect human rights and so on. But I mean, one certainly sees governments wanting in many cases to regulate content, and in a way it's an alternative to them to regulate for transparency, because regulating for transparency gives insight into what's happening in terms of actors and behavior in the companies and how the companies are dealing with these issues. And so it's a way, I think, that in between the extremes of laissez-faire at the moment, where nothing happens, and then over-regulation of content. If you put this in the middle as saying, well, regulate for transparency, I think this is a way that could avoid some of the pitfalls of doing nothing and doing too much. And it's in a way also, I think, an incentive for companies to know that because they could be scrutinized, to take greater care about their operations, how they spend their money, and so on and so forth. And I think that can benefit a lot more than government. For example, and this relates to this question of transparency and trying to get more specific things. I think you can, obviously, regulation is not well, you have law, you have policy, law, regulation, and one could argue they get more and more specific as you go down the pipe. But ultimately, you also want to come to indicators as well, and indicators for who. And so you might have particular policy, law, regulation, and indicators for elections, for example, or for health, or whatever the particular concern is. Or you can just have it at a broader level with a broader kind of instrument. But I think that what's important is that there's something that can be a foundation for further work, both by stakeholders and by companies, to respond to specifics. And I'll just give one quick example here. I mean, one of the things that we're concerned about at UNESCO is safety of journalists. And at the moment, there's no consistent reporting nor data available about online attacks on women journalists. And what we would like to do, and next year we'll do some consultations here, is like what does it take to get indicators for transparency on this question about online attacks on women journalists, and how can that build on broad principles, on existing laws, on existing regulations where these exist, and on existing transparency reports and existing company policy. But you've got to get down to the granular level ultimately if you want to understand this problem. and then propose ways to address it. So I think governments have got an important part in this ecosystem of contributing elements that then other people can build on.
Yeah, and if I could just follow up on that, and this wasn't a question we talked through, so I'm sorry for if this is a surprise, but in the poll at the beginning, many of the audience members said that they would be interested in greater transparency reporting from governments, transparency reporting on content removals that governments are instigating or requiring from platforms. I'm wondering if any of the panelists are seeing any trends in that direction, or lawmakers who are interested in that, because it seems like there is a real focus on transparency from the companies, which is appropriate and makes sense, but also perhaps governments should be looking to themselves and what sorts of transparency reporting they should do there. Have any of the panelists worked on that kind of more government-focused transparency reporting with respect to content removals or takedown demands?
Well, certainly in my experience with some of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that have brought governments, companies together, I haven't seen a huge amount of movement on this issue, if I'm honest, in terms of government. And actually, there's been an acknowledgement, I think, by some governments that they themselves wouldn't even know how to do transparency reporting. You may well have demands that come from courts who don't necessarily publish their court orders. You may have dozens of different law enforcement agencies at different levels, particularly within federal states. You may well have security services. You may well have government departments, advertising regulators, all of whom are making different demands to different platforms. And this data isn't centralized within government at all. So in many ways, in some cases, platforms are actually better at coordinating the data on this than governments, even though they themselves are often making many of the demands that we want transparency about.
Yeah, that's interesting, Richard. It's the same problem that Charlotte was describing within companies. If you don't track the data, you can't report it. Maybe they need the Google Doc that Charlotte was describing, or hopefully a more centralized system.
I was just thinking, what an incredibly interesting parallel, Richard. That's so right. And I think it does really illustrate this problem of centralization. Certainly something I think we've seen as companies get larger and larger and get, whether intentionally or not, more decentralized, is actually this question, where people are trying to figure out, well, what does a removal even mean? And it's one thing if you're like one company with one product, but what if you're one company with many products? What if you're one company with a bunch of subsidiaries, right? It's like you start to get this creep where, of course, people don't really know what's going on in any one part. And I think an amazing example of that is actually any government, especially these larger governments or more sort of federalized governments. I think that's a really interesting parallel that I hope could prompt some compassion, sort of organization to organization in our society, right? Like once things get complicated, it's hard to make it simple again.
Guy, did you want to?
If I can jump in, Caitlin, on this question. Indeed, I think this is quite an inspiring question. And perhaps people might see some potential in one system that does exist at the moment, but it's not, I think, a comprehensive scoping, but I'm sure people have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goals agreed by all the governments at the UN includes SDG 1610, which is public access to information and fundamental freedoms. And states are supposed to report on this. It's a voluntary reporting. And under the indicators, there are two indicators there. One is, do they have a guarantee, in other words, a lawful right to information? And do they implement it? And the other one is, what about the safety of journalists, human rights defenders, and trade unionists? And this gives quite a lot of scope to develop indicators where states can implement, can do it. And in a sort of mirror to what Charlotte was saying, at UNESCO, we get states, well, we encourage them because it's all political will and it's trying to build up momentum, but we get them to send us data on this access to information story. Do they have a law and how do they implement it? And very often, it's not that they don't want to respond, but they don't have the data about how they're implementing their right to information law. So they're not counting it, so they can't put it into their reports. So, I mean, it's quite evident that you also need capacity building and you need manageable indicators that are clear, that have got consistent meaning, that all different actors can use. And so it's very similar. And I think it could be something that people could try and build up in the future to develop standards for governments to report in as much as this is access to information and fundamental freedoms, it's about what are they doing to protect freedom of expression. And that means, so when they are asking for takedowns, are these, on what basis are they doing this? What kind of content is it? How do they rate the content they're asking to be taken down? How do they characterize it? And how do they count it? So it's something that should definitely be looked at, because it's a complement to what we are looking at with the companies.
There we go. We've brainstormed another multi-stakeholder process that can take place in 2022. I'm sure we'll solve it in 2022, the first 6 months probably. I want to turn back to talking about the company side of things. And Charlotte, you talked about some of the issues facing larger companies around collection of data. And I'm wondering, with respect to smaller companies, what do you see the differences there when they're thinking about transparency reporting? And what advice would you give to smaller companies who are maybe thinking about publishing their very first transparency report?
Well, my advice is, I think, maybe a little controversial for this audience, and so we should talk about that too. I mean, my first impulse is like, log everything, right? And it's because you're probably going to need it someday, both for transparency reporting and also because you might decide, oh, we need to be able to like spin up more sort of proactive detection methods, and this is the kind of data we're going to need to use to be able to do that. Now, log everything, not necessarily the same as keep everything, but it starts to kind of verge into this world where it's like, well, actually, we don't want to be like collecting every piece of data about users, do we? Like, we don't want to be keeping every piece of data about users, do we? Right? And there is, I think, this natural tension between being able to tell a complete story and being able to not collect all and hold all of this user data. And that, I feel, we as just a human society probably could use a lot of conversation on, sort of like getting those tensions, perhaps not resolved, but just more, getting more people aware of the fact that tension exists. I do actually in my job now give advice to companies. Well, make suggestions, some recommendations to companies who are in that position. And what I usually say is, first of all, look around, right? Look at what other companies are doing, because I think that is often a very good guide to what other companies have realized. Oh, this is practical and we can do this. But I think the other thing really is to be thinking from the beginning about sort of what your values are as a company or as a product, and how you want to be able to tell the story of your product in relation to those values, and be sure you are going to be able to with the data that you collect and how you then present that data. I think transparency reports in many ways are the most powerful storytelling that a company can do. And I think it really, if framed in that way, helps you achieve a lot of your business goals. It helps you achieve a lot of your reputational goals. But it needs to be thought of from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. And I think that's the advantage that newer companies have. A lot of companies were established before there was a transparency report, right? And so now they're kind of having to back into it and say, okay, like here's now what we want to say. If you're starting today, that's fresh, right? You can actually make decisions about that, incorporating that reality in a way that I think is very powerful.
Yeah, those are great points, and definitely the trade-off between the need to collect the data, to report the data, but also wanting to maybe not collect all the data or keep all the data is one that CDT talks a lot about with policymakers who are thinking about transparency reporting, because many of the proposals have very interesting ideas for information that could be reported, and the societal benefit is clear a lot of times, but the companies would have to collect some sensitive data that maybe we don't want companies to collect in order to be able to report it. So it really is a difficult trade-off.
And I do want to jump in. We just got a host and panelist chat from one of the audience members who said, have someone who knows pivot tables. And that's like, yes, right. That is like the best practical advice someone sort of new to transparency reports could take, is like, make sure anyone on your team is comfortable with pivot tables, because you can always add improvements later. And thank you to that attendee for making that point.
Some good practical advice. That's a good reminder also that if any of our attendees would like to pose questions to our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function or to tweet at us with the hashtag CDT questions, or email us at questions@cdt.org. We will take questions from the audience very shortly. Before we turn to questions, I wanted to ask any of our panelists who wanted to talk about another issue, which is kind of the maybe criticisms of transparency reports. We've talked a lot about the ways to improve them and their benefits of transparency reporting, but some people are skeptical of transparency reporting kind of overall as a process. And I think Evelyn Dueck in our last panel said that transparency reports can sometimes actually obscure information more than being illuminating. And I'm wondering if any of our panelists agree with that criticism in whole or in part, and if so, how you might try to address it through changes to the transparency reporting process. Would anyone like to have the floor on that question? It's an easy one, I know.
I'm happy
Richard,
to share. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So I think I'm going to be a little bit on the fence here. So on the one hand, I don't think we want to be overwhelmingly critical of the companies. That we've been demanding transparency, as many of us, for a long time. A lot of them are producing more, and it's getting better, and it's getting more detailed and granular. And that's because of the demands, particularly from civil society, actually, to sort of for this information. And I don't want to challenge how much effort goes into producing it and making it accessible. At the same time, though, as has been said, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. And of course, through transparency, you can, of course, manipulate what you want to show. For example, you can say as a company, well, we removed 99% of hate speech that we identify on our platform, which sounds great, but how much are they actually identifying of the total proportion of hate speech that exists on the platform? To take one random example. So I do think we need to kind of be constructively critical here. We need to consistently scrutinize and ask for better improvements for transparency. But I think to be wholly cynical about it would be a disservice to, I think, many companies who really are trying to do the right thing here and trying to be as helpful as possible, particularly in companies where there are other parts of the company saying, why are you doing this at all? Why are you being transparent? So there are some really strong individuals who are internally pushing really hard for this. I think we should give them credit.
Guy or Charlotte, would you like to weigh in?
So I think that this is a good point. And I think at the same time, if companies really want to establish their bona fides and convince people that they are accountable for human rights, then I think something that they could do increasingly is have a more meta, a kind of meta transparency report. In other words, transparency about their transparency and the progress they're in, because it should never be that they kind of are static. Of course, you want to, rolling data on similar topics, but this thing continues to evolve. And I think what's very important is for companies to be convincing about what steps they're looking at for future proactive disclosure or reactive disclosure to researchers. And so what is going to be availed, and maybe it's not stuff that's in the particular report, but it's ways in which people can get information from the companies through other mechanisms. So it's a kind of a guide, because in the end, a transparency report could be so long that, it's basically, it's unmanageable. But I think it could be quite useful to keep on showing that companies are really committed to, of course, respecting privacy and law enforcement and everything else, but to a momentum that is actually making this information available to stakeholders. And Richard's right, some stakeholders may manipulate, or I think that was your point, Richard, that some people can game the system. But on the whole, it's not an excuse to just kind of like hold everything close to your chest when you've got such a need for accountability, and when you're under pressure at the moment, because frankly, it doesn't seem that a lot of people have got a lot of faith in the companies to be doing the right thing, especially if it's going to cost the companies a bit more money.
I think that's such an interesting point, Guy. And I really like this idea of companies sort of illustrating their progress over time and sort of the way that they have thought, showed consideration on like, okay, we used to report it this way, and now here's how we've changed. TSPA did, our volunteers did a chapter for our curriculum about transparency reporting in H1 this last year. And I really encourage people to check it out, but not just because I'm going to shill that fantastic volunteer curriculum chapter, but because it gives a lot of examples from companies about here's how they have done it. And I think I would encourage folks in particular to take a look at the sort of reporting the transparency reporting trajectory that we've seen from Google, of course, from Twitter, from now Meta, and also from Cloudflare, because what you can see in the way that they produce their reports is that sense of change and progress. And they actually all, in various ways, talk about, this is something we're making different this year. We're doing it in a new way this year, and here's why. And then really explaining what, sort of that story is. I think those have been really interesting to read year over year, because you're able to get that sense of like evolving thinking.
Great.
If I can add another quick point, that in these UNESCO high-level principles, I think there's one that says companies should disclose also what they're doing about what we at UNESCO call media and information literacy. And this is quite an important thing because, if we're speaking about transparency, we also need to speak about the empowerment of users of transparency. And a lot of companies, of course, everybody knows the term surveillance capitalism because it was kept under wraps, the business model. And now, of course, it's become transparent, not necessarily through the activities of the companies or the disclosures of the companies. But what's super important is that companies do take some, responsibility to make sure that their users fully understand what is the business model, what are the risks, how to engage, how to protect yourself as need be, and that is part of transparency. Being able to show people that you do care about educating and empowering people concerning the use of your service.
Absolutely. I want to turn to the questions from the audience now, just in our last few minutes of the panel. So we have one here in the chat from Tim O'Brien, who's asked, what can we learn from an adjacent domain, Google transparency reports on government requests for data? And Tim writes about how Google publishes a report on government requests every year that's quite detailed. He explains what it is in the chat, and he says, Google is not required by law to publish the transparency report, but it does as a matter of company policy and takes all the criticism while lawmakers get a free pass. And I guess the question I would frame for the panelists off of that is there a disincentive to companies publishing these transparency reports? Because a lot of times they are criticized for the information that's contained in them, whether it's about government demands for data, as Tim raises, or about content moderation practices. So maybe Charlotte, I'll take that to you first, since you're someone who has some of the perspective from inside a tech company.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to need you to repeat some of that question because I was looking at the Q&A box and not listening to you.
No problem. The question is whether there's maybe a disincentive for companies publishing transparency reports because sometimes they are criticized after they publish them for not taking down enough content, for giving government too much data. Is that a concern that companies discuss internally?
Yes, and also companies get criticized for anything all the time, always. And so I think this is where it goes back to my earlier point about the company has to understand what are their values and why are they producing a report? Because I think, yes, there absolutely is. I think the world outside tech companies provides a lot of incentives and a lot of disincentives. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the right thing and put out a transparency report, right? I think a lot of the operational cost I've referenced earlier in producing a report is actually about that positioning, right? It's about trying to minimize criticism and trying to help people understand what's really going on in a meaningful way. I am not personally aware of any companies who say, well, we're not going to do one because it's going to raise more questions than it answers. It's going to be more of a problem for us. Some of that I think is peer pressure based, right? At this point, we've got these 800 else, I think it's considered more standard, but a lot of that is because the people who choose to do these jobs do them because they want to help, right? There are very few people who go into trust and safety today who are like, I'm just here to have a great time looking at crazy stuff, right? It's because this is seen as an important way to help our human society grow. And I think in that lens, right, there's always going to be an incentive towards transparency. I think it really it really requires society to ask good questions. And when there are critiques, as someone was saying earlier, to make sure that they're good and meaningful critiques rather than just trash talk.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. We just have a few minutes left. I'll take another question from the audience that also kind of steals the last question that I wanted to ask the panelists anyway. Glenn Kelly asks, if you could get all tech companies to produce one new exhibit or metric as part of their transparency efforts, what would it be or why? Or if you want to answer this a little bit more generally, what would you kind of prioritize for the next generation of transparency reports from companies? And I would love it if each of our panelists could give an answer. So Richard, I'll go to you first.
Gosh, how to choose just one. The one that I'm particularly interested in, which I think raises actually a number of broader human rights issues, is who are the people, the humans who are making these decisions? We know that there are now tens of thousands of people out there working on content moderation, looking at some of the worst images and videos within society. We don't know who they are, where they are, what training they get, what support they're provided with. Many of them will be working from home now because of the pandemic. We know that there are mental health and working conditions issues there. So this is perhaps an issue maybe for some of the larger companies, but I think we need to start thinking a lot more about the well-being of the people who are actually doing this very difficult work, alongside all of the kind of the data that goes alongside it as well. So that's something I don't think we've ever seen really in any transparency reports before, but I would love to start seeing.
Yeah, I agree that I think that's really important, Richard. And I would add to that, in addition to the well-being information about the training they receive, the languages that they speak and are operating in. There's been a lot recently reported on from the Frances Haugen leaks regarding content moderation in non-English languages and how lacking that is on Facebook. And it's also lacking on other platforms as well. So I think that would be a really interesting metric to look at too. Charlotte, how about you? What would you like to see?
I would love to see that metric and simultaneously wonder if such a metric can exist in a meaningful way. So that's often what I would contribute here. I think that this is, again, a sort of an operations question. I think it'd be really interesting to know amount of time people spent producing their transparency report, actually. I think that would be a very illustrative and informative question, if Richard has already taken my top choice.
Do you think that would cause companies to, would you want a big number or a small number there? I mean,
isn't that the question, right? I think it's like a good meta example of like when people think they're asking for something, what we have this principle in trust and safety, which is the no good number, right? There's not a good number. Either it's too many minutes or it's like not enough minutes, right? But like, what is it we're actually looking for as consumers of this information? And I think that prompt helps us sort of frame a lot of the other questions we're maybe asking about other stuff in that report.
Absolutely. Guy, how about you? I'll give you the last word. What would you like to see?
Well, I have to bounce the ball back and ask people to please make suggestions to us, because we're interested in this question of media viability. And of course, this is partially an issue of what platforms amplify, what they make discoverable, the kind of money issues, and we all know the disputes and both in the EU and Australia and so on, and then the issues of what deals are made with which publishers to give them what revenues. And so we want to do a consultation next year as to what are the indicators for transparency that would respect commercial secrecy, but which would enable a more informed and evidence-based discussion and negotiation about what changes could happen in the ecosystem to support independent journalism, which, as we know, is a casualty of the success of the platforms. So please be in touch with me if you've got any ideas about how we can build up a system of metrics that would be acceptable to the companies and, of course, the publishers and the media in this area.
That is a topic near and dear to my heart, guys. So I'm really glad to hear that Unesco is working on that issue. All right, well, with that, I would like to thank my three wonderful panelists, Richard, Guy, and Charlotte. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Emma Alonso, to close out our second day of the Future of Speech Online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thank you to Richard, Guy, and Charlotte. That was a really great discussion. And I think we all have a lot more ideas about how we can be improving transparency reporting going forward. So yeah, just thank you all for joining us for today's Future of Speech Online sessions. We'll be starting up again tomorrow at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central European Time for our final day of FOSO 2021 with sessions on researcher access to data, lessons from beyond social media, and also can transparency be mandated by law, looking at that question from across different legal systems around the world. You can still register for the event or join us on the live stream. Just check out cdt.org or follow us on Twitter at CendemTech for links and updates. We hope to see you again tomorrow. Take care.